page. Next week, November 11th, we have Dr. Jared Merkel. He'll be talking about ecology and conservation of ungulate movement and migration. So hopefully you can tune in for that one. To minimize disruptions by Zoom bombers and the like, the chats will be directed to the hosts. So after the talk, or even during the talk, as I just mentioned, you can type your questions into the chat to me, John, and I'll read the questions to Chris at the end. And once we get started, if folks, I'm sure you would anyway, but just turn off your video so we can minimize any potential bandwidth issues. So Chris is an urban ecologist whose research integrates theory with application to address human-carnivore conflict and also contribute to basic evolutionary ecology. Among other work, Chris and his lab have launched and conduct the Grit City Carnivore Project, with which they study urban wildlife in Tacoma, Washington. So we're really lucky to have Chris here today. I know he's been super busy. Sounds like busier than I know, as his birthday was recently, and we have some other events this week coming up, of course. But yeah, he's been dropping some really great science into a lot of the top journals in the last couple of years, and I'm hoping he's going to share a bit of that with us today. And for me, his talk comes at a great time, actually, because my mammalogy class here in SNR, we're doing a class project with urban coyotes, looking at behavior and activity patterns around Lincoln using camera traps. So I certainly hope my students are tuning in because they're right at crunch time for analyzing data and starting to write up their papers. So it should be quite relevant for us. Chris and I share a lot of research interests, which is how I came to know about his work initially, particularly canid ecology. Since then, I've seen him talk, luckily pre-COVID, at a couple of conferences in person, both about his work with coyote behavior, but also about race issues in the fields of ecology and natural resources. And as I think you'll see, Chris is a really engaging speaker, working on some really cool questions. So as many of you know, this semester, we had a dual focus with the seminar series. First, as usual, we wanted to bring in speakers from around Nebraska, the country, and the world to share great science with us. But second, we wanted to promote discussions about race and inequity within our fields of ecology and natural resources. So no question about it, Chris is a great fit for both of these goals and for our seminar series this fall. Luckily, he agreed despite a chaotic week for him and all of us. And so without further ado, I'll pass the mic to Chris and let him take it away.
Awesome. Appreciate you, John. And thank you all for coming today, given the craziness of the circumstances we're in. So I appreciate you taking a little bit of your time to hear about all the things. And the admiration goes both ways. I think John and I have been kind of in the same circles for quite some time. So we're very much looking forward to being able to continue to connect on all things urban wildlife and urban canids. But as the talk implies, today we're going to talk about wealth, race, and wildlife, and how the three intersect very much heavily in urban systems, but also outside of urban systems and non-urban environments, and why that's incredibly significant when we're thinking about the ways in which ecosystems are structured and what that means for wildlife generally, as well as conservation and sustainability. So I'm going to start us off with a premise. And by starting us off with the premise, hopefully we're going to roll into many different examples, case studies that get at this premise. The one being, and many of you probably already are thinking this, is that social inequality is an ecological issue. And by calling it such, then it allows us to understand how injustices shape our landscapes, both natural and social. And I do that very frequently through the lens of these animals, coyotes. So this particular coyote pup, who's about 7.5 weeks old, was a video taken from 2013. So now this puppy has kids and grandkids. But I provide this example for you because during my graduate work, I was really interested and still am interested in individual variation in behavior. Why do some animals do X while other animals do Y? This particular coyote is probably no more than 10 feet away from me. Again, reminder, this is a puppy. He was super courageous, so we called him Kal-El. For those of you that are DC fans, you'll know that Kal-El is the birth name of Clark Kent, aka Superman, because dude was just straight up fierce. So he's sniffing, and eventually I'll pan over to the rest of his family, siblings and parents included, and they're all pretty much in the back saying like, you got this, Cal, no worries, man. We're just gonna hang out back here. Now, most folks that study coyotes, you know that you see this variation quite often. Coyotes are predominantly cautious except for in many urban systems where they do behaviors a lot that look like a lot like this, right? So they're sniffing the ground, they're kind of nonchalantly moving throughout the area. Every once in a while, they'll look back at me, but for the most part, they're incredibly tolerant of people. Why is that? And how did that happen? But that question has been pretty much plaguing me, and I imagine John as well, thinking about what are the processes, the mechanisms, the structures that influence certain organisms, certain individuals to perform behaviors like this, which then leads me into this really awesome quote by Jeff Goldblum, of course, one of the best characters in Jurassic Park, who says the famous line, "Life finds a way." Well, certainly in cities, we could also say life is finding a way, dot, 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 in cities. And more than we know, there's so many examples of urban wildlife across the globe that are developing strategies to not only persist in cities, but thrive. Everything from these urban smooth-coated otters taken here in Singapore to raccoons in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, coyotes all across the Mountain West and the West Coast, as well as just generally North American, maybe even before the end of the century into South America. There are plenty of examples of organisms that are developing new strategies, phenotypic or otherwise, to be able to persist in cities, to the point now that we're starting to get many conceptual pieces that are taking a look at how environmental variation in anthropogenic or human aspects of the environment, such as noise, food, light, temperature, or the like, then influence the individual variation that's important for adaptive or neutral processes in terms of evolution, whether it be natural selection, genetic drift, or gene flow that influences the fitness of those organisms and then therefore influences population variation. So many of these processes are happening in incredibly rapid timescales. Think 10, 20, 30 years rather than 100, 200, 300,000 years. This is remarkable, and it's really contributing to this new field called urban evolution, where we're trying to understand how anthropogenic forces and drivers are influencing the way in which these organisms are surviving in cities. To the point then that human beings are integral in this system, it's important to use this idea that is kind of Hamilton-esque, right? We are both the directors and the audience. We're not only Lin-Manuel Miranda, who composed the play, composed the songs, created the stage, we're also the ones that are in the audience watching this as it unfolds, watching as a director is creating the stage by which these wildlife are interacting and acting towards us. And as a result, that influences the way in which we contribute to these animals' well-being, as well as the way in which the ecosystem is structured. So here I provide for you a conceptual figure from the recent paper published by Simone de Roche and colleagues and myself. Here are some of the lead authors on that paper talking about how society, things like human health and demographics, culture and education, transportation infrastructure, influence things like habitat modification, connectivity, and preference and selection, amongst many others that influence the ecology and the evolution of organisms that then therefore feed back as nature's contributions to people. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. These social ecological dynamics, now socio-eco-evo dynamics, as it's recently been coined, is incredibly important when thinking about how society, how we function, and therefore what are the consequences therein. Just a few case study examples from that particular paper. Here I show you, for instance, we can think about how urban habitat, for instance, standing water and impervious surfaces, influence the reproductive rate and body size of mosquitoes. That then therefore influences the way in which we manage those individual populations, whether it be fine or broad scale pest management at the individual or the community level. That will then impact insecticide resistance, population dynamics, and parasite virulence that goes, again, back and forth in this feedback mechanism. Same thing here with, say, Norway or brown rats, where you can imagine that food and waste paired with heterogeneity of building vacancies, as shown in several studies, not only just in Los Angeles, but also in New Orleans, New York, and several other major cities, that the number of building vacancies actually increases the amount of refugia for many rodent species. That then, over time, as people start to see increases in the abundance of those rodentia, then impacts their rodenticide use that influences individual and community level biomagnification of those toxins through multiple trophic levels. And finally, we can also think about the way in which management activity and action intensity influences the severity of phenotypic and genotypic change across many different species, and influences whether or not those species are locally extirpated, don't see any evolutionary change, or see extreme phenotypic change depending on how severe the conflict is and how frequent the conflict is with people. So this all encapsulates the idea that human pressures are critical when we're thinking about how these wildlife are adapting to cities and how we are adapting to them, which I bring to you this tree. I'm gonna have y'all think for a second about the significance of structure. Now, I provide for you a photo of a cherry blossom tree on the University of Washington, Seattle's campus, because I want you for a minute to put yourself in the shoes of the Lorax, right? So for those of you that have not seen the Lorax or read the Lorax before, when you were a kid, the Lorax was the protector of the trees. And as the spirit of said trees, it was important to see where the trees go, how the trees grow, and protecting said trees. So here we're gonna do the exercise. All of y'all are gonna be the Lorax and think about the trees. Think about the vegetation in urban systems as I show you this side-by-side comparison of neighborhoods that are no more than a half a mile away. These two neighborhoods, on the left, University Place, on the right, Southeast Tacoma, again, are no more than a half a mile away from each other. You already probably can see where I'm going with this. Look at the amount of green on the left relative to the amount of green on the right. You probably also could see where I'm subsequently going with this. If I were to ask you, which of these neighborhoods do you think is essentially more expensive or has a higher median household income relative to the other? You likely would answer the left side. The plots are bigger, there are more trees, the landscape is fundamentally different than the landscape over here, where the houses are smaller, there's greater impervious surface cover. This has a term. It's known as the luxury effect. This idea that species richness and biodiversity often are positively associated with wealth. Now, mind you, this isn't always the case, and there are several recent meta-analyses that have taken a look into the fact that there are some cities that show no relationship and some cities that show the opposite relationship, where the more green you get in these low-income neighborhoods, you end up seeing greater species richness and biodiversity. And that has a lot to do with the history, which we'll get into a little bit. But before that, the luxury effect and how wealth influences ecological communities has been seen across all different trophic levels. From primary producers, looking at tree species diversity, all the way to greater overall vegetation diversity, all the way up through to tertiary consumers, looking at mammalian occupancy in sites. However, for mammals in particular, there's really only one study that legitimately looks at that, Magley et al. So some of the work that we've recently been doing with the Grit City Carnivore Project in partnership with the Urban Wildlife Information Network, also known as UN, is setting up cameras throughout multiple cities across the United States to see how universal or global this luxury effect is for mammals in US cities. So just a brief aside about the Urban Wildlife Information Network. It is a partnership of researchers using wildlife monitoring techniques to understand the ecology and behavior of urban species. And in all of these cities, 29 and counting, we use some level of an urban to rural gradient where we can assess how different organisms navigate through different parts of our cities. So for the Grit City Carnivore Project in particular, we have been monitoring urban mammals since fall of 2018, and at any given point in time, here you see a map on the left of where we have many of our cameras, or where some of our legacy cameras have been in the past. We have anywhere between 29 to 36 cameras in different month blocks, from October being our fall season, which we have cameras up right now at this particular point in time, to January being our winter season, April being our spring, and July being our summer season. So this protocol was originally established by Seth Magley, Mason Fedino, and Liza Lehrer at the Urban Wildlife Institute at Lincoln Park Zoo. And here in Tacoma, Washington, we have been using these cameras to not only monitor how wildlife move through our cities, but also how people perceive those wildlife. So that yields a bunch of excellent photos of animals that move throughout the city of Tacoma, as well as we have our partners up in Seattle that have a similar transect network. Anything from, say, black-tailed deer here in the top left to our coyote who is poking at our scent lure that's stapled to the tree, to this photo here taken about 3 blocks away from UW-Tacoma's campus, some raccoons just practicing their parkour. And I can't end this talk without the cute and cuddly. So certainly we can also use the camera for video assays. And John and I are together in this nationwide project with Julie Young, Stuart Breck, Roland Kays, and several others to take a look at differences in boldness across urban and rural sites. But also we get these cute and cuddly charismatic megafauna, right, that are just copping a squat, but doing all things cute when not doing anything at all. So I like to say that this baby bobcat also was taken, you notice the date, right? March 9th, 2020 was right at the point when we went at stay-at-home order. So luckily we were able to get some data during the pandemic as well. So what did we find? Well, here I'm just showing you some preliminary evidence from a paper that Seth, Mason, and I and several others in the UN network are putting together. I've only really extracted out here species richness on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis looking at income scaled by cost of a 1-bedroom apartment for both Seattle at the top and Tacoma at the bottom. So here what we're seeing is that income does seem to predict species richness in urban mammals as well. Now mind you, these are preliminary data, but these are also taken from a linear mixed model using Bayesian stats to then put and fit a Pearson correlation across many of our different sites, each of these dots representing one site across our multiple years of data. So this is promising to show that yes, indeed, there does seem to be some income gradient, but it should be noted that income is a proxy, right? So what else is being influenced by, say, the proxy of socioeconomic status? Well, we know that there are many abiotic factors that are also relevant to this luxury effect, from water to heat to air pollution. I like to call this particular segment the Avatar Last Airbender because we literally get into all of the elements. The first being here, urban heat island effects. So for those of you that haven't heard of urban heat islands before, urban heat islands essentially talk about how in the city, it could be anywhere from 3 to 10 degrees hotter Celsius relative to rural areas. That's because of differences in heat absorption and retention, plant transpiration, the amount of impervious surface cover relative to the amount of vegetation cover, so on and so forth. If you were to take that index and look at heat across many different census blocks, compare those census blocks in terms of their income gradients, and then to urban heat island effects, you will see that there is substantial overlap to income and how hot it gets. So the lower income the area is, the more likely you are to feel really hot temperatures. Should be noted that when you can control for income, you start to see how race and ethnicity also play a role in these data. If you're interested, here I provide the link for y'all to take a look at your respective city. And there are many cities that NPR put together for this expose. Second, air. So a recent paper by Christopher Tessum and colleagues in 2019, published in Nature Sustainability, looks at air pollution inequity and whether or not it's disproportionate across Black, Latinx, and white groups. And what we find here, the blue line is for white Americans, the orange is for Latinx groups, the green is for Black Americans. The pollution inequity index here is showing that if you have an index above 0, that you're experiencing more pollution burden relative to the amount of pollution you're generating. If you have below 0, you're generating more air pollution than you are experiencing the burden therein. And what we're seeing here is that this particular line from 2000 to 2015, that white individuals within multiple cities, even after you control for income differences, still generate the majority of air pollution relative to Black and Latinx communities. It should be noted, we're right in the middle of a pandemic, which is part of the reason that we're doing this particular seminar over Zoom, that air pollution indexes are also linked to whether or not you contract and die of COVID. And this is particularly exacerbated during climate change. So this figure here on the left is taken from one of my good friends and colleagues, Kimberly Terrell, who works out of Louisiana and works in this stretch of the Mississippi River called Cancer Alley. The reason it's called Cancer Alley is because many industrial sites and pollutants are co-located along this strip of the Mississippi River. After Southern Reconstruction, after the Emancipation, what ended up happening is that many Black residents in Louisiana were relegated to Cancer Alley. And many EPA regulations were tamped down in this region in order for industry to thrive. That has resulted in huge amounts of air pollution that also, coincidentally, it's not a coincidence, has led to the multiple high rates of deaths from COVID. And here on the right, you'll see a photo on the left from San Francisco. This was right after, if you can believe it, it was only a month and some change ago, when huge wildfires ravaged the Pacific Northwest, as well as just the West Coast generally. And here's a photo on the right that is fictional from Blade Runner. The photo on the left looks a lot worse than the projections for 2049, right? So certainly air pollution inequality, who's going to feel the majority of that inequality are going to be those that are disenfranchised and marginalized to the corners of our society. And then finally, water, it should be noted, I really don't even have to mention this because you likely know where all of these photos are taken. And unfortunately, this crisis is still ongoing. But the Flint, Michigan water crisis, in which government-sponsored say and policies went into changing where the water sources were and what pipes were being used, influenced water quality fairly substantially. Unfortunately, the inequity in who is experiencing that water, that poor water quality, is not new to Flint, Michigan, but is felt in many different communities, those that are predominantly Black and brown across the United States as well. So earlier I provided you all a little bit of a preamble, and I said how the luxury effect doesn't predict everything, right? So this particular meta-analysis here done by Kuras et al. In 2020 takes a look at the luxury effect across all of the empirical studies that have actually looked at that for both flora and fauna across many different land use considerations. And in some instances, you can see for, say, residential, you have a really high case of positive outcomes, but it's not universal. And it's definitely not universal as you go across different types of land use considerations. So this is important because it helps us to start to get outside of the box about what is influencing these income gradients. What is influencing the discontinuities of the city that says that wildlife are in one region of the city, but not in the other region. And in some instances, in some cities, like say for instance in Chicago, you could have a high income neighborhood and a low income neighborhood that are only separated by one major roadway. So that really implores us to understand how bottom-up processes from society, and you can also think of them as top-down, right? So this pincer move of how society influences the ecology and evolution of urban organisms, right back to the feedbacks we were talking about, the social ecological dynamics or socio-eco-evo dynamics of how structural racism and classism, like residential segregation, law enforcement, immigration policy, resource allocation, gentrification, and the like, are all influenced by systemic biases that influence all of the landscape processes we just talked about. So urban heat island effects, where the impervious surface cover is, where the green space is, all is influenced by the decisions and the policies that we make at the state, regional, and federal level. So to that point, I like to share just a little bit of a story to really kind of crystallize this for y'all. And as you probably can see, right, I share pop culture references quite often when I'm doing my lectures or I do seminars because it helps to create cognitive maps between what you may know, but maybe you don't see the bridges in between. So here, this particular image is taken from a poster from Watchmen, the Watchmen series on HBO. And Regina King in the show, which if you haven't seen it already, you gotta watch it like yesterday because it's legit. In the very first episode, what we see is a close-up view of what the 1921 Tulsa Massacre looked like. For those of you that don't know what the 1921 Tulsa Massacre was, in 1921, there were allegations that a Black man had harassed a woman in a hotel, and immediately that Black man was arrested and put in jail. There were rumblings that there was going to be a lynching the next day. So many members of said Black man's community came to his defense to say that this is an allegation that is completely false. They peacefully walked away, but as they were doing so, there was a mob of white organizers that then went after the Black organizers and the Black community in Tulsa. At the time, Tulsa was considered part of Black Wall Street, where much of the wealth for Black Americans was generated. And in a matter of hours, the KKK and several other members that had ascribed to white supremacy bombed the town and killed more than 300 people, displacing more than 300,000. So this particular example, again, unfortunately, is not novel. Stuff like this has happened in Philadelphia, and as recently, say for instance, as the LA riots, which I was 7 for. Why is that important? Well, because of the fact that many government-sponsored programs have structured the urban landscape that you are currently on right now. So what your landscape looks like, what your home looks like, where you grew up, was planned and organized by a particular program known as redlining. So this program was government-sponsored from the 1930s to 1968. And pretty much describes the systematic denial of various services to residents of specific, often racially associated neighborhoods or communities, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. If you're curious and would like to know more about what redlining is, I provide here this photo of the cover of the book called The Color of Law, written by Richard Rothstein, that talks about how many policies that were federally sponsored were put in place that designated these A through D types of regions. A on this map that you see are green. They were deemed predominantly white and very wealthy neighborhoods. B was right next to it, right? So B was also good to live in. Whereas C in yellow and D in red were deemed hazardous locations to be in. And many Black and brown residents that were trying to purchase a home were relegated to those neighborhoods. There are stories that abound from many of our ancestors that talk about how they would have appointments with housing agents, and housing agents wouldn't show up. In some instances, the housing agents would just show up in their car and wait and surveil the potential Black homeowners that were coming. Loans were denied to potential Black owners if they were inquiring about a house, even if they were out offering over asking. And of course, many of these red and yellow neighborhoods were proximately located to industrial waste sites and pollutants. And if you go to the Mapping Inequality Project, here I provide for you a link, you can search where your home state or home city was in that particular history. So for us here in Seattle and Tacoma, here's a Tacoma map, there's a Seattle map. It gives us a really good understanding of how the landscape about 50 years ago still has an impact today. We also oftentimes take a look at San Francisco and Oakland, which are some of the more profoundly residentially segregated neighborhoods. And one of the recent papers that just dropped, it was a preprint from Dexter Locke and colleagues, shows, as we just talked about, follow the trees, like the Lorax, right? Well, in 37 US cities, most of those cities show that these A regions, which again were predominantly white and wealthy, still to this day have a greater propensity of tree canopy cover relative to the degraded regions. Now, it's not universal for all cities. Say, for instance, Seattle, there seems to be a trend, but it's not necessarily significant. The point being is that this is pretty profound, that we're seeing this across from Philadelphia to New York to Los Angeles, from coast to coast. We're seeing how redlining is impacting the primary producers that then ultimately will impact other different trophic levels in kind. So therein, if you remember at the very beginning of this talk, I started with talking about how social inequality is an ecological issue, right? So now, given the evidence I've shown you, if we accept that premise, then we then see that environmental justice is perhaps the most potent form of urban conservation and sustainability. In fact, it is the form of urban conservation and sustainability, and likely the form of conservation and climate activism moving into the future, where we very substantively and authentically think about deconstruction, reconciliation, and community mobilization as important pieces, linchpins, if you will, keystones to solving the current issues that we needed to solve yesterday. And that means centering civil rights as a prerequisite to environmental health and in the environmental justice narrative. If we create better environmental health, if that is our goal in order to bring more species, not only into cities, but also outside of cities, then we need to center the rights of our peoples. And that's all peoples. And that fight has been going on for quite some time, right? It continues to go on now in our current civil rights movement, and even into today, as we are waiting on pins and cushions to see what happens with the election, because we know we need to fight. We need to fight for the change, because that change in our society changes the way in which our natural world will or will not prosper. It's in our hands. And as a result, that may mean that we need to have a paradigm shift in how we think about conservation success, where we think about building equitable capital and fighting poverty as the main ingredients for conservation success, rather than thinking only animal centric. And that means thinking everything from affordable housing and how that creates stability in ecological landscapes, to accessible healthcare and how that benefits positively the One Health system, that which talks about how human health begets wildlife health, which begets human health, all the way to, yes, strengthening voting rights. And that fight is in y'all's hands, right? That fight is in all of our hands as we constantly in this current context. And again, even today, right? It's kind of apropos that we're talking about many of these issues and how the social and natural world come together with each other on a day right after many folks put in their ballot to have their voices heard, to amplify their voices. The fight isn't over, and we need to continue that fight because it's our planet that's on the line. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge a bunch of folks that are named here, but also those that aren't named, that constantly are working behind the scenes to do all of the work that you've seen today, empirical or otherwise, as it takes quite a bit of time to really deeply think about and comb the literature on how these connections are made. So I with that, we'll open up for any questions you may have, and feel free also to reach me through email as well as Twitter. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. That was awesome. So let me, yeah, as Chris said, let's open it up for questions. So any questions from the audience, just type them into the chat, and yeah, I'll read them to Chris and we'll go from there. And I remember last time I didn't see all the questions. They went to maybe to the other Chris, who's also a host. So if anyone else is seeing them, just jump in.
If any come to me, I'll pass them on. Usually it takes a few seconds for people to get their fingers moving.
Sure.
Any audible or chat sighs of relief are also warranted.
Well, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll just ask a selfish one. I was just curious, Chris, it sounds like most of the work that you're doing there with the Tacoma project is with cameras, which is great. Do you guys do any tracking with telemetry within Tacoma as well, or is it pretty much mostly with cameras?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We have been using mostly cameras in the last 2 years, but trying to ramp up to start doing some more telemetry work, because looking at kind of organism by environment interactions would be really fascinating on how, say, animals move through different parts of the landscape. And if, say, for instance, we could build predictions on whether or not, if you have a home range that consists of mostly C and D regions relative to A and B regions, what are the consequences of that likelihood, right? Like, what are the considerations for your diet? What are the considerations for your physiology? What are the considerations for population genetics? And there are several other folks that are interested in that work as well, in St. Louis, in New York, and otherwise.
Cool. Yeah, that's awesome. And I really hadn't thought about it until your talk here, but you know, we're really interested. I'm really interested in trying to start to understand predator-prey dynamics, mostly using telemetry in urban centers, where we just don't understand if large carnivores or any carnivores play the same ecological roles. And I really hadn't fully considered the role of the differences in primary productivity and how that might play a role in those higher trophic levels. So yeah, it's cool stuff.
Yeah, and I imagine too, right? Thinking about how human shields even play a role into that. So where the human
Absolutely.
shields are and how strong those shields are relative to how strong, say, residential segregation is would be really interesting to see how like deer and rabbits and rodents all play a role in where they are and whether or not they spatially or temporally are kind of stratified across the landscape with coyotes and bobcats and foxes and bears. Really, it's a wide open chasm of questions we could start to address.
No doubt. Well, I'm getting flooded here with questions in the chat, so I won't hog the rest of it. But I may have my PhD student reach out to you that's involved in predator prey stuff in LA, and
yeah, definitely.
I think there's some good ideas there. So let me get to some of these questions. I'll try to take it from the top. So from Brianna Wolf, such a brilliant presentation. Thank you. A great distraction and also very relevant to the issues we're all worried about right now. So I think a comment, not a question. From Sarah Thompson, what would Dr. Schell suggest as a remedy for the divide between greenery of wealth and impoverished neighborhoods? What way could the government intervene in urban design without disenfranchising or disproportionately hurting the poor?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And when I talk to city officials, they oftentimes ask that question too, and whether or not, okay, so should we plant more trees in neighborhoods? And I would say, no, that's not completely the answer. It's maybe part of it. So certainly plant more trees and plant more vegetation when there's community buy-in, number one, and then also create safeguards that allow for residents that oftentimes in low-income communities are renting their homes, provide a path to ownership and one that is substantial. So then that way it reduces the amount of displacement of human communities, which, as we talked about earlier, displacement of human communities creates instability that then creates instability in those green spaces as well. Good anecdotal example. Here in Tacoma, we have Point Defiance Park, which is second only in the amount of land coverage or space to Central Park in New York. So it's the second largest municipal park which is crazy, in the United States. So you think you would see a bunch of different species of wildlife, mammals in particular, rather than just like raccoons and deer. And yet that's almost all we see with the camera traps that we've had up for now almost 3 years. This is all we see are raccoons, squirrels, and deer. Barely any coyotes. We haven't seen any foxes, definitely not any bobcats. And we know that there are reports of, say, long-tailed weasels, but we haven't captured them on camera either. And that's particularly because of the way in which people utilize that green space. So the amount of folks that walk through the green space is on the order of thousands. So even with the space, it's kind of like if you build it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the wildlife will come, which is part of the reason why it's important to get both community buy-in and really think deeply with urban planners about how do you create, say, wildlife corridors, green corridors across the city that have very low disturbance regimes while also making sure that the system around them is stable in terms of the built environment. Then that helps to not only have folks have greater access to green space, which is good for their physical and their mental health, but also is good for the wildlife, which then have the ability to have refugia away from human beings, and then promotes diversity of different types of tolerance levels across many different species.
Great. Another question, and forgive me if I may have missed part of your last answer. This one's somewhat related because I was reading these questions, but I know you mentioned city officials. So this question from Christine Steggs is, have you presented any of these findings regarding tree canopies to the city council? If so, how did they respond?
Yes. So yeah, we talked to the city of Seattle, and though the mayor of Seattle was not present, watched the recording of said presentation afterwards. Their response was pretty positive. Whether or not that response would be the same across all of the different municipalities in the Pacific Northwest? No idea. But some of them were already thinking about many of these issues in the past and what it means to think about greening spaces while avoiding green gentrification. So the idea that if you plant more, that it leads to greater gentrification because housing prices increases, taxes increase, and therefore people get displaced, right? So now a lot of city officials are thinking about, well, how do we provide green space and the types of green space that community members would like, and then have this level of compromise. And that compromise oftentimes comes in the form of community organization around urban gardens, solar power, and thinking about the ways in which you can blend urban planning and housing with different types of vegetation. So it should be noted, right, we've been talking about trees a lot, but there are many community members that don't like trees at all in these neighborhoods that could use trees because they're perceived of as dirty, or they host a lot of pest species that then create other human wildlife conflict problems. So John and I probably vibe on this a lot, right? Like we think about human wildlife conflict in cities all of the time. So you think like, oh, greening is the positive for everything, but no, with every action, there's a reaction, and that reaction isn't always positive. So how you plan means that the planning needs to be done by the members that are in those organizations. And luckily, many city officials are now opening their ears and their eyes to like, what does it mean to center the science that we work on, community engagement, and traditional ecological knowledge together in that trifecta? Whether or not there's action, we're not sure. There have been many conversations in the last few months, but we're hoping action comes fairly soon.
Agreed. Next question here from Brianna Wolf. I'm in a place where the gap in urban green space is massive when it comes to wealth, Mexico City. Do you do any of these studies outside of the US? If not, definitely consider here. This is a hard one, but do you think there is anything an average citizen can do to help mitigate this inequality?
Yeah, so those are awesome questions. The first is yes. So the UN network is looking to engage other partners in Canada, Mexico, South Africa, and several other countries that are interested in many of these questions. Mexico City would be awesome to set up a network there and really take a look at those differences, primarily because many of the studies in luxury effect start to show, if you look at effect sizes, this paper recently from Chamberlain and al. Did so in 2020, that was published like a couple months ago, shows how precipitation predicts how strong the luxury effect would be. So that would be really interesting to see if we look at cities that are closer to the equator, that are drier, where precipitation is much more stochastic, do we see these greater impacts of the luxury effect? So that's to your first question. To your second question about whether or not we'd be able to see this just generally in different cities, different regions, different countries, different communities. I would be also really curious to see whether or not different types of political structures influence the way in which luxury effects are or are not felt. So that would mean, all right, well, if you look at, say, a capitalistic society like ours, relative to one that's more socialistic, where resources may be more evenly distributed, do you see any differences therein? Like, are there any differences in countries that have a greater distribution that's of equitable wealth relative to those that have a lot of folks that are towards the bottom and very few at the top? And that question is really hard to answer. It likely would take an entire career, but there are some inklings from papers a couple years ago showing that greater economic disparities predict greater biodiversity loss. And that hasn't stopped. So yeah, they're all really excellent questions. How you can get involved, third question, as an individual is really thinking about how you listen to your other community members around you about their views and perceptions of wildlife, and then also thinking about how you impact the landscape. Perhaps the easiest one you could do is like, if you have a cat, keep your cat indoors, right? Daily PSA, keep your cat indoors for so many reasons, because of, say, disease transmission of different zoonotic diseases that cats carry, as well as cats, and it's not their fault, they're just good at it. They're perhaps the most efficient predator on the planet. Keep them indoors. So that way we have greater diversity of rodents lagomorphs and birds. But the other is just like generally with your domestic pets, make sure that if you say have a dog, walk them on a leash, right? If you are thinking about how, say, litter and food is distributed across your city, thinking about making sure you secure your trash cans, because we know that food subsidies are also a major incidence of conflict, which then scales up. Eventually, it scales up to the point where management agencies are going to make decisions as to how they are then taking out wildlife accordingly. So as an individual, there's quite a bunch you can do, but certainly it takes a community of individuals that are all acting together.
Okay. Next one here is from Larkin Powell, and it's somewhat related. It's also got an international focus. So Larkin says, first, so good. Thanks so much. Would you say that some of these models extend into places like Southern Africa where we push different forms of wildlife-human conflict solutions?
Yep, absolutely. So there's already a couple of studies out of Cape Town that are taking a look at exactly that particular point. And yeah, even there, we're starting to see many of these relationships between landscape heterogeneity generated by the people and where the animals are. Many of the countries in Africa are very interesting and unique because their charismatic megafauna really are megafauna. They're a lot bigger than a coyote. So say for instance, several different townships in different countries in Africa have spotted hyenas. That's very different than thinking about what raccoons do in the landscape. So how those relationships with people materialize and how those populations are managed accordingly may be slightly different. It should be noted that not only are there differences in how the landscape is shaped and then indirectly influence those different organisms, but the way in which those organisms are perceived is different too. So in some townships in different countries in Southern Africa, spotted hyenas are seen as deities that come through towns and eat all of the bad spirits. So they are loved, they are revered. Whereas for those of you that are carnivore researchers, particularly those that study coyotes here in the States, you know that many folks in many different cities see coyotes as pests and as vermin that need to be destroyed or eradicated from the city. Very different cultural views that also have potentially very different religious views as well. That juts up against right into capitalism too. So the way in which agricultural farms and say livestock perceive carnivores is also inherently different from different countries, even though those different countries still have pretty strident economic losses when say an individual animal, in whether it be sheep, cow, or otherwise, are taken from a carnivore. So what that means is that the policies that are put in place to mitigate those are also influenced by this inequality, whether it be racial, gender, economic, or otherwise.
Got a question here from Mira Gunther asking kind of a methodological question, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So have you found any applications of computer vision and machine learning for helping build models when using cameras to capture species data and other applications?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that we personally in the UN network are exploring different options, and even in the Grit City Carnivore Project, we have Microsoft that's right here. So there are several graduate students that are working with different Microsoft teams to think about machine learning processes. Recently, I think maybe less than a year ago, a paper came out with our code that's able to do some of that machine learning using JAGs and several other networks. We have not personally done it yet. We've been using mostly a pretty sizable volunteer base here in the Seattle-Tacoma area to tag photos for us. But yeah, I think that's on the horizon, is thinking about how do we use machine learning to tag these photos in a more efficient way, but then also help us to inform what are some of the areas, say if we were looking at fine scale microgeographic habitat use, how can we then position our cameras accordingly to capture certain clades of organisms relative to others. So that's all ongoing work that's really nascent, but really kind of going to be substantial here in the next 10 to 15 years.
Great. Just a couple more here, and thanks for leaving so much time for questions. It seems like we got a lot of them. So this one here, I know you mentioned One Health during the talk, but this is again from Brianna Wolf, and She's a grad student with Nebraska One Health and says that urban wildlife is in their purview, but they've really not worked to tie it to environmental justice and the human aspect connected to this. So I guess she's curious about connections with your work in One Health.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my really good colleagues, Maureen Murray, who's also at Lincoln Park Zoo, is a wildlife epidemiologist and urban ecologist. And her and I and several others have been thinking about how One Health combines with urban wildlife, combines with inequality, and how environmental justice is sort of the solvent to all of that. Because, and here I'm going to give you some published data. So Katz et al. In 2019, which is one of the papers we recently cited in that DesRoches et al. Paper, shows how in Baltimore, low-income neighborhoods have greater degrees of impervious surface cover. That's relevant because when there is rain and when there is water, there tend to be more standing pools of water on that impervious surface. Why is that particularly important? Well, because mosquitoes don't need much to be able to breed, and it could be a small pond that's no bigger than a red Solo cup, and they are able to breed in that small retention pond. Individual organisms, so mosquitoes in particular, Aedes aegypti, that are in low-income neighborhoods tend to have a greater reproductive rate, tend to grow bigger, and they grow faster. That increases their virulence and their ability to spread zoonotic pathogens across the human communities that reside in those areas. So that means that these low-income communities that were planned by government intervention since the 1900s is influencing the virulence of mosquitoes today and how likely it is that disease is going to spread across those communities. That's just mosquitoes. We could also make the same call about rats, which there are recent studies that have come out of New Orleans showing that after Hurricane Katrina, many of the homes that were dilapidated and not restored in mostly low-income communities served as refugia for many rodent species that were able to pass many zoonotic diseases from their populations to pets and to people. So the disease susceptibility of low income and communities of color is greatest because of the fact that there was not much aid from FEMA to predominantly Black and brown communities. So decisions made by our government, state, regional, federal, local, whatever it may be, how power dynamics and privilege essentially play a role in who is and is not healthy. Perhaps the best example of this is COVID, right? The majority of folks that have been dying from COVID are Black people and brown people. And that's because of the legacies that were put on this landscape way before all of us were born on this call. So that influences the wildlife that then also feed back onto us as well, which starts to stack a layer of comorbidities that if we don't address the underlying issue with environmental justice perspectives and principles that have been named, frankly, since the 1960s, then we'll never be able to fully, substantially, on the long term, address many of these One Health epidemiological issues.
Okay, and I think we just have one more, and it may overlap a bit with some of the earlier stuff, but maybe a good one to end on is, you know, we're all interested in the applications for our work. So it says, it's from Caitlin Kirby. Thanks so much, Chris. Are there any particularly effective policies that your work suggests as a first step for improving urban ecology for humans and animals, and any cities that are modeling some of these policies and approaches?
Yeah, there aren't many cities yet that have done anything permanent that helps to really understand bridging the divide between our natural and social world. But there are some rumblings, at least in West Coast cities, from Seattle all the way down to Los Angeles, about what it means to create affordable housing and how the affordable housing crisis is essentially a piece of the climate crisis. So there are folks that are floating around potential policy ideas of rent control forever, meaning rent never increases over time, and that there are paths to home ownership. That's also on the table. There are some organizations in the South Bronx that have been really instrumental in what it looks like to re-green spaces while making sure that property taxes stay low and don't go through the roof. It should be noted that not in the United States, but in several other countries across the globe, Singapore being one of the best examples, is how they've used urban planning as a mode of not only innovation, but sustainability that's led to the increase of populations that were threatened and in decline. So at the very beginning of the talk, I talked about urban smooth-coated otters. About 25 years ago, Singapore was losing them at a rapid rate. So they put in plans that would create greater greenways, as well as the ability to put in bike lanes rather than, say, roadways, to reduce the amount of vehicular mortality that would happen for these smooth-coated otters, which they realized that many otters are trying to cross the road because they were getting from one waterway to the next waterway and just getting smacked by cars. So not only are they the most advanced in terms of sustainability and kind of green tech, but they're also the most advanced in creating corridors for those urban smooth-coated otters. And you'll see photos and videos of these otters now creating nests for themselves under highway passes because they were able to hang on long enough to become tolerant long enough, so behavioral ecology right there, to then have population rebounds. So there are many little examples like that all over the globe, and it's encouraging that if we were to take all of those and cobblestone them together and think about how we can see this and this pandemic as an opportunity to rethink how we create our cities, not just for people, but for wildlife, we could become really technologically advanced and have many wildlife as kind of part of our cities. And I think that's a really kind of tremendous opportunity for us.
Definitely. I think that's all we have for the questions in the chat, and that was a great way to finish. So yeah, no question about it. I think those of us that do work, and I certainly didn't start working in urban ecology, but got interested in it, and now I see it as a big part of what I do. And I think that's the key there, is that cities don't have to be wastelands for wildlife or natural communities. They're real opportunities. And integrating that in with the human populations is obviously the key to success there. And so, yeah, I think a lot of what you shared today is stuff that a lot of us as ecologists probably don't pay as much attention to as we should. But yeah, really, really interesting stuff. So I kind of forget how we do the applause here for these things, but I'll just say thanks a lot, Chris. That was really great. And I think we all appreciated it.
Yeah, thank y'all. Appreciate you all.
Thank you so much. That was great.